let me move forward and introduce our speaker, who is Dylan Dorey. And Dylan has very kindly and generously agreed to speak to us tonight about something near and dear to his heart, namely the Kartchner Caverns State Park and the natural history there and some of the interesting things that he's observed where he's been working. So let me fill you in a little bit on Dylan's background. His official position at the park is the Cave Unit Park Ranger 2. And Cave Unit is the park's name for its on-site natural resources team. His department's main focus is maintaining the health and safety of the cave through continuous data collection and analysis and environmental monitoring, although that description only scratches the surface of all the tasks and projects they oversee, both in the cave and on the surface in the park. Dylan started working for the Arizona State Parks in March of 2019 and started off as an interpretive seasonal ranger, mostly giving cave tours. With all the time he was able to spend in the cave and the more he learned about and he found himself falling more and more in love with Kartchner Caverns and wanting to become more involved. In November of 2019, he became a full-time interpretive ranger and was able to take on more educational and outreach projects. In June of 2020, he transferred into the cave unit position that he currently holds. This is the first natural resources job that he's had, and it was the realization of a personal goal he had. So he obviously was very pleased with the position that he was able to achieve. Although he has no formal botanical training, he has always taken an interest in the subject and has become pretty decent in his opinion, which I'm sure is a good one, and a self-taught botanist. And his boss concurs with that as well, so that's good to know. Anyway, being in the Natural Resources Department now has afforded him an opportunity to put some of that knowledge into practice and learn even more. So we have Dylan Dorey from the Kartchner Cavern State Park, which if you haven't been there, you certainly should. Certainly if you're a resident of Cochise County, where it's so close, it's a really magnificent thing, as Dylan is going to tell us. Okay, so I'll turn it over to you, Dylan.
Okay, thank you so much for that introduction, Doug. Yeah, I'm Dylan. Like I said, I work in the Natural Resources Department, and basically our job is to maintain the health of the cave. I mean, that only scratches the surface. And from the very, very beginning of the story of this park, Kartchner Caverns has been one of the best researched, best protected, best preserved show cavern, one of the best in the world. And so basically our job in the natural resources is to try to maintain that reputation that we have. Kartchner has always been a model for other caves to come to. Yeah, so no pressure on our department, right? But a lot of this is due to the individuals involved from the very beginning, from the discoverers to the people who own the land, to who work in the state parks department. They're just a lot of extremely dedicated, hardworking, passionate individuals that just absolutely loved this this jewel that we have in our own backyard. So yeah, basically we're trying to keep that up. And I do want to kind of start with just briefly go over a bit of the discovery story. If you're unfamiliar with the discovery story, it is a fascinating story. There's a lot of players involved, a lot of factors, a lot of things that could have gone wrong, and then everything just kind of came together in the end, and the stars aligned. So anyways, I want to just kind of give you guys a background behind the scenes of how we are able to stay at the forefront of scientific discovery, what we're doing here on a daily basis. And yeah, I guess let's just start from the beginning. Yeah, so first of all, this discovery story is an extremely long story, so you're going to be getting pretty abridged version of it, but I think it's extremely important to know the story. I think it really played a major role in us becoming what we are today. So let's just start at the beginning. Okay, so 1974, that is the very beginning. Gary Tennant and Randy Tufts first discovered the cave. On the right-hand side of your screen there, that is a picture of Gary and Randy. Gary is on the left-hand side, Randy is on the right. And they did not exactly look like this when they first discovered the cave. They actually found it, when they found it, they were about 23 and 25 years old. So this picture was taken a little bit later on. I think this was maybe taken in the 90s, but look at them, they're still going. They still got their helmets on, they're still caving and stuff. So they definitely had a passion for it. And on the left-hand side of your screen, you're going to see that is the sinkhole entrance. That is actually our only natural entrance to the cave at this time. It's been the only known entrance since they discovered it. And that's what it looks like currently today. In fact, I did take that picture today. But it's going to look pretty similar to how it did in 1974. There's definitely been some erosion. There's definitely was a collapse in the 90s that had to be shored up. So it probably is a little bit bigger than it would have been back then, but it gives you a good idea of what they would have stumbled upon, minus the green ladder, of course. But yeah, that sinkhole was actually a pretty well-known area. Randy himself had been down there 7 years prior. In 1967, he and some of his caving buddies were out in the area looking around. His friend Steve Wade actually came across this hole. They dropped down there, maybe about a 10 to 12 foot drop. And at the bottom, there's a couple smaller rooms down there. They squeezed through. And there was evidence that people had been there before. There was trash, there was graffiti. They looked around. It didn't really look like it went very far. So they left. Randy actually marked that spot in one of his notebooks, and he called it Wade's Cave after his friend. But then they pretty much forgot about it for about 7 years. And then fast forward in time, 7 years later, Gary and Randy are heavily involved in the local caving scene out of Tucson. They're part of the local grottos, and they're actually in the area of the Whetstone Mountains searching around for caves. Let's be honest, every caver's dream is to find a beautiful, pristine, untouched cave that hasn't been found before, right? So they were definitely looking. They were looking for caves. Excuse me. And on that day in 1974, the conditions were absolutely perfect. They decided to visit that sinkhole again, and they discovered the cave on that day. They discovered Kartchner Caverns on that day. They followed some airflow. And boy, oh boy, what a discovery that was. What a fascinating experience it was for them. And not only did they discover a cave, they discovered an absolutely beautiful cave, a pristine cave, a large, gorgeous cave. And I've got a map here for you. I apologize, there's not a scale on here. I must have cut the scale off. But anyways, in total, they discovered about 2.4 miles of passages. And it took them about a year and a half to map out this entire area. They didn't find it all at once, obviously. This is a pretty large cave system. But down here at the bottom right-hand of the screen, that's about the area where the natural sinkhole entrance is. And from there, it was a pretty tough going at that point. They had to crawl through a very small opening that was barely big enough for them to get through for a few hundred feet. They came to an area that they ended up calling the blowhole. Keep that in mind. We'll come back to the blowhole later on. But it was not easily navigable. They took them quite a bit of effort to get through that first part. But once they squeezed through the blowhole, it opened up a bit, and they realized that they had discovered something absolutely priceless in this area. The bottom right, the large section there, that is our big room complex. They called it the big room because it was really big, right? And they explored around in there for a while. It was maybe 7 to 8 months later, maybe a little longer. They were exploring some of these back passages where they actually came across the rotunda room. and the throne room was the very last thing that they found. And these three rooms are what you will see if you take a tour. And even though it looks like there's a lot of passages back there, and there's a decent amount of passages, the majority if you take both of the tours, you're going to be seeing 75 to 80% of the cave in these larger rooms. And a lot of these back passages are pretty small, hard to navigate. So definitely the crown jewels are in the rooms that you've seen on tour. But if you haven't seen the throne room, it's just absolutely gorgeous, an absolutely gorgeous cave room. But yeah, so super exciting discovery, right? Like they found this beautiful, pristine cave. And what's the next steps, right? I mean, Gary and Randy, they never found anything of this magnitude before. Obviously, no one had been in it. There was absolutely no evidence that anyone had been in the cave. And they were extremely conservation minded. They realized that this was a unique environment. They realized that it had never been touched. And they realized there was a quote from Randy where he said that the cave didn't ask to be discovered. They found it. And they also realized it was in a pretty vulnerable position. It was pretty close to a highway, pretty close to a major highway. There had already been people in the sinkhole, evidence of that. And unfortunately, being part of the caving scene, they had seen a lot of caves that had been just destroyed by vandals, by graffiti, trash everywhere, broken formations. Pepper Sauce outside of Tucson, that's a good example of a cave where every single formation has been broken. So pretty sad, and they obviously did not want that to happen here. So basically, the name of the game was secrecy. That was the big thing. Gary and Randy, they actually managed to keep the cave a secret from the general public for about 14 years. And here in the bottom right, we have a picture of a little bit younger Gary down there, waist deep in water in one of the back sections of the cave. And then top left, we got Randy underneath some stalactites there. But so Gary and Randy were pretty methodical individuals, but at first they really weren't sure exactly what to do. They knew with that vulnerable position, they couldn't just keep it a secret forever, right? And there was definitely a small group of individuals that they brought with them that were let in on the secret at first. I mean, for various reasons, safety concerns, help with mapping, things of that nature. But like I said, they mapped out the cave for about a year and a half. After they realized, or after they were confident that they had completely explored the underground passages, they kind of stopped going in for a while because they realized that every time you go underground, you're making an impact. And they didn't want to turn it into a recreational cave. They wanted to keep that pristine environment. But slowly over time, as the years passed, that small group of individuals, through no fault of Gary and Randy, slowly becomes a little bit bigger and a little bit bigger. Maybe one friend that they took in there takes a small group of other friends, such the way as it goes. And it wasn't like this was still a super known cave. If you still went to the local grottos, it wasn't like everyone was talking about it. It was still relatively secretive, but Gary and Randy realized that things were starting to slip away a little bit. And by 1976, Randy was reading an article about a uranium rush that was moving into the area. And at that point, there was a figure that shocked him. He read that there was 446 mining claims in the Whetstone Mountains alone. So that added another layer of stress on top of protecting the cave. It could have been damaged by drilling, groundwater contamination, what have you. And then you also have the issue of people possibly finding the cave. So they're starting to get a little nervous. They realize they need to do something. They can't just keep this cave a secret forever. They're very methodical, and they start researching how to start businesses. Randy starts hitchhiking across the country to other show caves. At this point, he had just read an article by Russell Gurney entitled Conservation Through Commercialization, which basically just means developing a cave or any area, not necessarily a cave, but protecting something by developing it. So if you can control the access to something, you can control how it's used, right? So that kind of gets at the forefront of his mind. So he's thinking maybe they can somehow acquire the property, maybe they can do that. At the time, they were thinking that it was on national forest land, but actually later they learned that it was private property owned by the Kartchner family. And here's some pictures of the Kartchners here. Top left, on the left-hand side, that is James Kartchner, patriarch of the family. That's next to him is his son Fred. They're obviously inside of the cave. The bottom, the black and white photo down there, that is a picture of James Kartchner on the far right with 9 of his children. I believe he had about 12 children, I think, 9 of them with him in that picture. And even though it's a black and white photo, you can still tell that they had just come out of the cave. Their clothes look pretty muddy and wet, right? They had a little excursion down there. But they kind of threw another wrench in Gary and Randy's plans. Now they're dealing with private property. Like the Kartchners owned the land, so because of that, they owned the cave as well. And they were worried. They were worried that they would possibly, if they knew about it, that they would possibly exploit it. Tell Gary and Randy they couldn't come back. Basically, shake hands, walk away. Thanks for telling us about this cave. Now we're going to make a bunch of money. But being the methodical individuals that they were, they started researching the Kartchner family, researching. And the more they learned about James Kartchner, the more they started to like him, basically. He was a really salt of the earth type of guy. They found out that he was a retired science teacher and superintendent of schools in St. David, which is where he lived at the time. So good news, right? But still, they didn't completely trust him. But in order to move forward with their plans, they had to basically do one of two things. They had to basically either acquire the property from them without them knowing about it, or they had to work with the Kartchners. And so they're super nervous. But after all the research, they decided, finally in 1978, 4 years after discovering the cave, they decided to approach the Kartchner family. And they kind of had a little bit of a strategy. They actually had one of their real estate agents approach James first. And they approached James on his property in St. David and basically just had one question, didn't tell him about the cave, didn't tell him about Gary and Randy, but they asked, would you be interested in selling some of your land? James Kartchner's reply was, no, it's family land, we don't sell family land. So there goes option one, acquiring the land from Mount Vernon, right? But what might have seemed like a disappointment to some people was actually a good sign to Gary and Randy because they realized that he actually cared about his property and he wouldn't just sell it to anybody who came along. So that was actually a good sign for them. So eventually they decide to actually go meet him in person, and they don't come right out and tell him it's a cave. They just basically come to him and say, hey, we need to talk about something on your property. And they're kind of feeling each other out a little bit. It's a potentially awkward encounter. Gary and Randy, let's just say that they were like Vietnam War era counterculture. So they were hippies, basically. The Kartchner family was small town Mormon pioneer family. So it could have been a potential awkward encounter. And a funny story is Gary, before he went to meet the Kartchners, he was a guy who always was wearing kind of scrubby clothes, big army jacket, big old bushy beard. He actually trimmed his beard down, eventually ended up shaving it off, got rid of his army jacket to wear a suit and tie so he could make that really good first impression of the Kartchner family, which I thought was pretty funny. They cared about the cave so much and they just wanted it to go through. But anyways, they approach the Kartchners, tell them they need to talk about something they found on the land, and they bring a slideshow with them. And this slideshow has pictures of Kartchner in its basically its pristine beauty, and it has pictures of other caves around the area that have been vandalized. So trash graffiti, stuff like that. Basically, what they're saying is this is what you have, this is what it could look like if you don't protect it. And it's pictures such as this one here. There's a picture of young Randy in the strawberry room. Next to a almost column there. But the Kartchner family is impressed with the slideshow. They're impressed with their presentation. And but Gary and Randy basically have a stipulation before they even told them what it was, that whatever they decide to do with it, they wanted to be involved. And they made them kind of promise that before they told them what they had. James Kartchner ended up agreeing, showed them the slideshow. He was impressed. He says that he's willing to develop a working relationship that would include all of them, but there was just one stipulation. He wanted to see the cave first, which is completely understandable. It's his cave, basically, it's on his property, right? One problem, though, is that Gary and Randy were a little bit worried. If you remember from the beginning, I was talking about that hard to navigate passage, the only way into the cave. And crawling on your hands and knees for 20, 30 feet till you come to the blowhole. James Kartchner at the time is 78 years old. And I got a picture of the blowhole here for you guys. You can see what it looks like. That is Steve Holland. Here's Steve Holland squeezing through that blowhole. Not the easiest passage to get through, not undoable, but definitely not something you want to tell your anybody to just go through, right? But James Kartchner, he was in great shape. He wanted to go through. They warned him about it. And here we have Mr. Kartchner himself squeezing through that blowhole of 78 years old. What a guy, right? Yeah, he made it through. Him and 5 of his sons basically take the trip through the cave on that first day. And they're extremely impressed. Fortunately, James Kartchner was just wanted to protect this cave just as much as Gary and Randy did. At that point, they basically approached the Kartchners with their proposal. And here's some more pictures of inside of the cave there. But they basically decided that they had 4 options moving forward. One, they could either gate the entrance, they could seal the cave entirely, they could possibly turn it into a research cave, or they could commercialize it. And after weighing the pros and cons, they decided that commercialization would be the best route to take. And so they all kind of come together and they decide that's what they want to do. They want to develop the cave. It would probably have been relatively easy. The Kartchners already owned the land, right? They kind of drafted up business agreements. And I think Gary and Randy's original vision was for it to be a private nonprofit corporation. But not really as easy as it sounds, right? They definitely hit some hurdles along the way. About two years into that, around 1980, the Kartchners decide that they don't want to develop it themselves anymore. There's kind of a financial crisis going on in the country at that time. So basically the Kartchners say that they're out. They don't want to do it anymore. They still want to protect the cave. They want to sell it. They're not going to give up the secret, but they don't want to develop it on their own. So it kind of leaves Gary and Randy in a bind for about the next 3.5 years. They basically go around looking for approaching other nonprofit organizations, looking for somebody to possibly develop the cave. And this whole time they're still being super secretive. They're being ultra subtle. They're not going into these offices and saying, hey, we got a cave, we want you to develop it. They're kind of dropping hints here and there, feeling out these organizations as to whether or not they might be interested in taking on this sort of project. Maybe if they came out and showed them pictures of the cave in the beginning, maybe it would have been a different story. Who knows, right? But they had to be careful. They were worried. They were definitely worried. And eventually they ended up approaching the Desert Museum. They approached the National Park Service. But everyone pretty much declines. And by 1984, they're kind of getting a little bit desperate. They're giving up on the idea of turning it into a showcase. So they actually approached the University of Arizona to see if they'd be willing to, possibly take on a research project. So basically turn it into a research cave. And again, they kind of declined, but the person they talked to, I can't remember exactly who it was, the person they talked to basically gave them a lead. At the time, Arizona State Parks was actually, I think, 48th or 49th out of 50 states in terms of the number of state parks. They already had a lot of national forest land, national parks. They didn't really put that much money or effort into their state park system. But enter scene Bruce Babbitt, Governor Bruce Babbitt. We love Bruce Babbitt. He was a great guy, super conservation-minded governor. He had a degree in geology. And basically, when he came in to be governor, he wanted to revamp the state park system. So he was on the lookout, and at U of A, the person they approached at U of A basically told him, hey, Arizona State Parks is kind of looking around to acquire new properties. Maybe you should try them. And so they did. And enter scene Charles Etherly, right? Who I believe I might have saw his name here in the attendees this evening. But anyways, I believe he was the director of state procurement at the time. They approach him. He doesn't really, whereas the other organizations they approached, they were very subtle with everything. Charles wanted to know what they had. So he was basically like, what are we looking at here? He didn't really want to take these subtle hints as an answer. Eventually, they found out that it was a cave. He wanted to know where the cave was. Or he wanted to see the cave, excuse me. He wanted to see the cave. Gary and Randy are really nervous. They're still being very secretive at this point. But eventually, he convinces them to take him to the cave. In order to move, at this point, like I said, they're getting desperate. This is their best opportunity at this point. In order to move forward, they need to talk to this guy. They meet him in Benson. And I apologize if I'm getting this story wrong, but I believe they met him in Benson and then actually blindfolded him and then drove Charles around for a while before they took him to the cave because they didn't want him to know where they were going. Anyways, they take him through the cave. He sees it. He loves it. He just is impressed. And I think they kind of reach agreement. They want to move forward with this, but they asked him at one point if they decided to go to pursue this route, how long might it take for this to become a reality? And basically his answer was minimum 2 years. And at this point, it's been 10 years since they discovered the cave. They're getting more and more worried. And the problem with approaching a public organization, when that organization is trying to acquire public lands, it basically becomes public knowledge, which was the thing that they were trying to avoid. So they don't really think this is a fast enough process. At one point, one of them approaches Governor Babbitt himself. And cool story about this is when they actually went into Governor Babbitt's office, there was a painting of the Whetstone Mountains behind his desk. So that was a great sign, right? The Whetstones is where Kartchner is. And they ended up taking Governor Babbitt through the cave as well. But this is a legislative process. It takes a long, long time. Nothing's really been set in stone at this point, but it's being talked about. And in 1986, there's a bit of upheaval. In 1986, unfortunately, James Kartchner passes away due to Alzheimer's disease. Bruce Babbitt actually leaves office to pursue a career in, I believe, the Senate. He's replaced by Governor Evan Meacham, if you've heard that name before. Not necessarily, yeah, we'll talk about Evan Meacham. But, and at this point, the Kartchner sons are kind of becoming disenfranchised, disheartened. They're almost about ready to give up. And they just kind of plan on sealing the cave, much to Gary and Randy's chagrin. But fortunately, in 1987, Ken Travis comes along. All right. Now, Ken Travis becomes the executive director of parks, and that is Ken on the right-hand side, next to Randy in the middle, and then Gary. And Ken Travis has big dreams for the park system. He gets taken through the cave. And during all the couple of years since they've actually approached Mr. Etherly, he's still been thinking about it. It's still, that proposal is practically still on his desk, even though it's been a long process. It's still something that everybody wants to see happen. So conversations sparking up Travis, Etherly, Gary, and Randy. And at this point, Governor Meacham ends up facing an impeachment trial. He's got like 6 felony counts against him. And this is when they decide to strike, right? The legislature is super busy. There's a lot of stuff going on. They feel like they can sneak a bill through that complicated process without giving away the secret. So they develop a strategy. There's a lot of legal stuff going on here. I'm going to keep it as simple as I possibly can. I don't even understand all of it, but they basically want to propose a secret innocuous bill that has to do with state parks' funding. And it basically allows the state parks organization to keep their own money for development, and kind of an innocuous bill, right? So while everything's going crazy in the government there, they send the bill through the Senate. It passes. After it goes through the Senate, they amend it slightly different language, and send it through the state house. It ends up not passing the state house because I believe the Speaker of the House would not concur since it was amended, which set up a Senate House committee. And this is all part of the plan. But basically the goal was to protect the secret during the entire complicated legislative process. And this is a process that took quite a few months, if not a year. I'm not sure exactly how long that took, but would have been a long time for people to know where the cave was, right? So yeah, basically the goal was to keep the secret until it went to that Senate House committee. And then finally, once it got there, they would amend that bill once again to actually include the acquisition of the cave, which at the time they were calling the JAK property, or the James A. Kartchner property. And but just in time for that final vote. And in 1988, it passes. They purchased the property from the Kartchner family for about $1.5 million. And it officially becomes the 25th state park in Arizona, which is pretty cool. By that point, Governor Meacham had already been impeached. At that point, Rose Mofford was the governor, and she signs in the bill wearing a caving helmet, right? Gotta love the drama there. I wish I had pictures of that. Unfortunately, I don't. But here's a kind of celebratory photo. This is post-development, but Gary and Randy there on the side, Jeff Dexter in there as well. But yeah, 25th State Park. And so now they are faced with an entirely new challenge. And basically that challenge is, how do we create a tourist attraction which brings thousands of people a year? How do we create that attraction in a cave where the major appeal is its pristine quality, right? And they realize in order to protect this cave, they have to study it. Like, they need to know exactly what is going on. They need to know everything about it. They need to know the microclimate, the ecology. If they're going to keep it protected, they need to know how it started off before they start bringing people in, right? And so Tennant and Tufts and a few other local cavers establish a nonprofit organization called Arizona Conservation Projects, and basically their job was baseline studies. And we're going to talk a little bit about that. But yeah, the established baseline studies, they spent about 8 years, I believe. So it was 1988 when they acquired the property. It wasn't until 92 when they actually started development. So they spent about 8 years studying this cave, and that's one of the reasons why it is one of the best researched, best protected caves around. And just here's a small list of some of those baseline studies. We are going to touch base on a few of them. We won't have time to go through all of them. But microclimate was a big one, flooding monitoring and the invertebrate studies, rockfall dating that had to do with stability. When you're bringing people into a tourist cave, stability is important, right? water infiltration monitoring, the bat population, extremely important. We'll talk about the bats. Isotopic decay. Isotopic decay is pretty cool. I'm going to be real brief about this. I'm not going to get too deep, but basically, oxygen isotopes in water, when water evaporates, the faster it evaporates, very put simply, the oxygen isotopes left behind will be different depending on how fast that water evaporates. So you can actually see, if you take a sample of water from inside the cave, you can determine, but you can basically determine when that rainfall occurred, because during the summer months, hotter summer months, evaporation is going to be a lot faster. Winter months, it's going to be a lot slower, right? So by doing these studies, we're actually able to determine the type of rainfall that is best for the cave, which is pretty cool. And they found that winter rains, predominantly most of the water that's making its way into the cave, building our formations, come from the winter rains. Summer rain, it's just too fast, it kind of runs off the hill. It's good for the plants, but yeah, the winter, we have snowfall, we have slow soaking rain, so it really soaks down and is able to permeate through that rock. But hydrogeology, mineralogy, sedimentology, all these studies were conducted prior to development. They covered all of the bases. They got and basically studied every little nook and cranny in this cave that they possibly could. And I want to talk a little bit about the microclimate studies, because this is extremely important. So caves are extremely stable, consistent niche environments, right? We're talking about environments that do not change for hundreds of thousands of years. So they studied humidity levels, air and soil temperatures, the amount of water actually coming into the cave, which is more of like a seasonal variation, but there's still long-term trends you can track with that. Like air exchange rates, concentrations of various gases, all these factors were included in those original studies because they needed that baseline. They needed to see what this cave has been like for the past couple 100,000 years, right? And there was various different techniques employed throughout this. The one I want to focus on, I want to talk a little bit about our EMS stations. It stands for Environmental Monitoring Stations. There was originally 22 of these situated throughout the cave. We currently still have 14 of them that we have set up. And for 20 plus years, we have been checking these stations at least every 2 weeks. So we had 20 plus years of temperature, humidity, and CO2 data from the same exact spot in those caves since before development. So pretty cool, right? We can have all that data, we can analyze it and be able to track long-term trends. And let's do a picture of what's going on there. On the left-hand side there, that is actually my lovely coworker, Catherine Halter. She was working at one of those environmental monitoring stations. And these have been exactly the same since they were brought in. And originally these came in through the sinkhole, so that's why they're pretty small and portable. But you basically got a pie pan, a cookie sheet. Pie pan is filled with a specific amount of measured water. That cookie sheet's on top to avoid water dripping in from the ceiling, skewing the results. And basically we come in, we take all of that water out. We measure how much has evaporated, fill it back up to the appropriate amount, put it back. So we have evaporation rates. On top there, you can see a couple of thermometers. We measure both wet and dry bulb readings. So that gives us air temperature and humidity. We also take CO2 levels here. And on top, you're also going to see a hobo data logger, which is basically an extremely sensitive thermometer. And those live in the cave on top of that station, and they measure temperature every 6 hours. So going back, I'm not sure exactly when we installed those hobo loggers. I don't think it was from the very beginning, but going back at least since the early thousands, we have temperature readings for every 6 hours in the cave. So really important and really beneficial for us to track those long-term trends, because if things start to change, we can correct that, you know. And there's been instances before where we have had to um, adapt and change the way we do things. Examples are, we learned that we had to start fogging inside of the cave, um, just by bringing 200 to 600 people a day through the caverns. When you're inside there, you literally rob moisture. You're soaking up moisture, your hair, your skin, your clothes. That takes a toll, right? And we can see that because we have those long-term trends. And eventually we started fogging inside the cave. We only introduced maybe a gallon of water through foggers back into the cave system every night. Another example is when we first developed the cave, we used halogen light bulbs. Halogen light bulbs run really hot. Those were in there for about 18 years or so. And we were able to see that the temperatures were trending upwards, the humidity was trending downwards. Eventually, about 2 years ago, we completely redid our entire lighting system, switched over to LED bulbs. And since then, in just those 2 years, we've seen a drop of about half a degree in temperature. And originally, we had seen almost 1.5 degrees increase from the baseline studies. And I know that doesn't really sound like a lot, but like, once again, we're talking about very consistent environment where things don't really change that much. And yeah, so important for us. So we're also this map here. We take temperature readings along the tour trail, and that just gives you an idea of some sites. Every week we check this because the tour trail is a little bit, it definitely shows more impact quicker because that's where the people are. And we also do rock temperature readings as well, where we use an infrared thermometer. But once a week, we track that and make sure everything's okay. But now that they have basically established the climate in the cave, it was then time to understand the ecology, right? When you have such a stable, specialized niche environment, you're not dealing with a lot of extremes. So such a stable environment is going to breed very specialized life, very specialized organisms that can't really handle extremes or even slight variations on either side. So that's another reason why we needed to keep monitoring those levels. But when they're studying the ecology, they found that it basically all came down to the bats, right? The bats were the start of the entire ecosystem in the cave. The bat guano is extremely important for the obligate cave creatures there. And during the initial studies, they found nine different species of bats. And the main species that uses the cave is our Myotis velifer, which is common cave bats, and they actually use it as a maternity roost, which is extremely important, not only to the cave ecosystem, but also to the bat species as well. Every year, our bats come back in the summer and they give birth in our cave. The environment, the high humidity, the warm temperatures is absolutely perfect for them to give birth there. And in the beginning, they also did some experimental studies to see whether or not they could conduct tours while the bats were there. Definitely didn't work out. It stressed out the bats, and when you have female pregnant bats, do not handle stress very well. If you start disrupting them while they're in their maternity roost, chances are that they will eventually abandon it, which would destroy the entire ecosystem in the cave, would be detrimental to the bats, right? So really important that we establish that baseline. Since that first initial study, there was 3 more species discovered, giving us a grand total of 12 bat species recorded on the park. There's a list of them there. Yeah, and once again, the common cave bat, the Myotis velifer, is the most common one found in the cave. Some of these bats do use the cave as well. Not all of them actually roost in the cave. There are some that are migratory. There are some that just roost under bridges, but all of these bats have been actually recorded on the park property. So here's a little picture of Myotis developer, such a cute little guy, right? Look at how cute he is. And there's a timeline for you there. Every year from April 15th through October 15th, the big room side of the cave, which is the side that the bats use, is closed for tours to accommodate the birthing process. And you can see there all the way from beginning of May when they're pregnant until end of September when they're actually started leaving the cave. I do want to talk about some of the studies that we're currently doing with the bats. One of the studies is mist netting, headed up by Debbie Beecher. She comes out, and this photograph is from, I believe, 2019. That is, I believe, a canyon bat, Parastrellus hesperus. And they call it mist netting because we basically really fine nets that don't trigger they're so fine that they don't really trigger their echolocation. So a lot of times they can't see them unless it's really windy and they're moving around, of course. But you notice there's a little Q-tip there. Oh, this cute little guy. And basically we're swabbing for Pseudogymnoascus destructans, which is the fungus that causes white nose syndrome. If you are not familiar with white nose syndrome, it's a terrible thing that's been happening. It's a fungus that it loves a cave environment. It grows on their noses. It basically grows on them and it irritates them and can actually wake them up during hibernation. And bats hibernate for a reason, right? If they get woken up, there's not a food source around. So a lot of them, they either starve to death or freeze to death, which for one is not a good way for them to go. And it's just been decimating bat populations. Back east, there's certain species, I'm forgetting the species right now, but there's certain species that basically it's wiped out 90% of the species. So swabbing for that, it has not made it to Arizona yet. It is getting closer and closer every year. But yeah, it's something we look for. And yeah, so that's an ongoing study. We also contribute to the NA-BAT program, which is an organization that's monitoring bat populations throughout the entire country. And we do emergence counts where we actually count our colony. And the way we do that, this is real fun. We have a camera down at the sinkhole. We go into a room and we stare at a screen. We play back the footage from peak that time and we come out. We have 2 clickers. And when a bat comes out, we click. When a bat comes in, we click. So click, 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 click. And at the end, we subtract one number from the other, and that basically gives us a general overview, general idea of how many bats we have. And then finally, we do acoustic monitoring every year, which is more of a passive way of monitoring the bats. Mist netting is pretty hands-on. Acoustic monitoring, we just basically put out an antenna with a microphone and a little detector. It actually records bat calls and plug it into a software called Sonobat. Gives us a little sonogram of bat calls. And I've got a quick slide here. You can see what that kind of looks like. Now, it takes a lot of training and a lot of patience and a lot of study to be able to identify bats using this method. Yeah, well, I'm not going to get into that, but I believe this is a Myotis developer call. I'm sure I might be corrected on that. But yeah, really important that we protect our bats. And next step after the bats, down from the food chain, is the invertebrates, right? Because like we said, the entire ecosystem starts with the guano. In 1989 to 91, they did the first invertebrate studies. They discovered about 39 species. They did another study in 2009 to 2011, which revealed 59 more, which gave us a grand total of about 98, 16 of which were actually entirely new to science. And what I thought was cool was that at least 14 of those species were completely restricted to the annual guano cycle, which means they're directly dependent on the bats. So during bat season, when the bats are there, when that fresh guano is there, they hatch, they're active, they feed. they go through the season. Once that fresh guano is done, they mate, they lay their eggs, they die off, wait till the next season, and then the next generation comes in, which I think is really cool because it really shows you how important the bats are to the cave. Without the bats there, those 14 species just would not exist in the cave. But anyways, I included a link there. That link at the bottom is actually Bob Pape. I don't know if any of you know Mr. Bob Pape, but he did the 2009 study, and that is actually his invertebrate page. You can go there, visit that if you want to copy that down. And there's pictures, there's descriptions, there's all kinds of cool stuff, and you spend a long time on there looking around. So unfortunately, I don't have enough time to show you all the invertebrates there. One more cool study I really want to talk about was the uranium series dating. This is really cool because we basically got to see how old our formations were, right? And in order for this to work, you have to take a core sample. We only did that off of dead formations, so broken formations, but we took a core sample, we took 30 of them, only 19 worked. And when a formation is formed, a small amount of uranium can actually be incorporated into the calcite, which is what the formations are made out of. And uranium is radioactive, it decays, it has a half-life. And by measuring that, you can determine the age. Of those 19 samples, they came back between about 40 and 200,000 years ago, all of our formations that we sampled. And there was a large cluster of them that came back at about 70 to 140,000 years ago. And what also was cool about that was there was pollen found in those samples. So when those formations were being formed, pollen was being washed into the water and was being deposited inside of the formation. And unfortunately, the paper did not mention specifically what species were found, but the species that were found matched those, or very similar to those that are currently found on the Colorado Plateau, which is a much cooler, wetter climate than what we have here in Cochise County. And most of the pollen that was found was in the samples that occurred between 70 and 140,000 years ago. So it's kind of a cool puzzle, right? You can use caves, you can study underground and actually learn what the surface world was like 70,000 years ago, right? And what does that tell us? You know, there's a lot more formation growth. That means there's a lot more water. There's a lot more pollen, and pollen is coming from plants that grow in wetter climates. So yeah, you can kind of put the puzzle pieces together and figure out a bit there, which I think is cool. There was also agave pollen found, which is very similar to the species that we currently have on park. But anyway, a lot more studies. I can't go into all of them. This link here is a link to our science page on Kartchner Caverns. And on that page, you're going to find another link for an annotated bibliography that I put together. I actually went through every article, every scientific article that I could find that was published on Kartchner Caverns and wrote up a little synopsis. And if you go to that webpage, click that link, you can find all the articles. If you want to learn more, you can search the articles. So that's a pretty cool resource if anybody wants to see that. And I'm going to go through these next few bits pretty quickly. We're running out of time here, but I do want to talk about one study that we are doing currently, which is pretty cool. We just kind of started this last year, but it's LIDAR. If nobody has heard of LIDAR, it basically stands for light detection and ranging. And it's a handheld scanner that uses light in the form of a pulsed laser to measure distances. You basically take this little scanner, move it around, laser goes out, bounces back. And you can actually build a 3D map of what you are scanning. And we did a preliminary scan of Kartchner. I just want to show you what those pictures look like. Pretty cool, right? But it's pretty accurate. You can even see the handrails. You can see the people down there. And these are pretty zoomed out versions. The reason we're doing this study is for stability. You can get pretty intricate with this process. You can scan a smaller area and with a lot more detail, and then actually tell you, you can measure faults that way in any movement. So if you were to scan, say, a desk-sized area and it had a rock in it, and you move that rock, let's say 3 millimeters to the left, and then you do another scan, you'll be able to see that change. So it's a pretty intricate way to study stability, which is important because once again, we got people coming through the cave. So far, so good, frankly, right? But yeah, I'm gonna go through this really quickly because we are running out of time. I want to go over a little bit of the development. Mainly, I just want to share some of these pictures with you because these pictures come directly from the Kartchner vaults. I found a bunch of these live in a box up in our attic. So you can't really see any of these anywhere else, and they're just cool to see. So I'm just going to go through this really quickly. Look at that happy bunch of development crew there. And for what they did, for as much, for lack of a better word, destruction that was involved in putting in a trail and building these tunnels and developing this cave, they did an absolutely fantastic job keeping it as pristine as they did. And big shout out, this guy on the left-hand side here, that is Chuck Duncan. He's obviously a member of the development crew, but he is also still a ranger at Kartchner Caverns. And I believe 2004, when development was over, he became a park ranger, became a tour guide, and has been with us ever since then. And he is a character, that's for sure. So if you haven't met Chuck, you have to meet that guy. He's fun. But that little hammer he's holding there, interestingly enough, they didn't use any motorized equipment. They were worried about fumes, so everything was either pneumatic or electric. Because of that, they also didn't have motorized transportation. So all of the equipment, all of the concrete was brought in using either wheelbarrows or bucket brigades. Not exactly the easiest place to push a wheelbarrow, right? And you also notice in that picture on the right-hand side there's some plastic tarps hanging. And it's a pretty small area. There definitely had to be some cutting. There definitely had to be rocks moved around. And when they were doing work that kicked up a lot of dust, like cutting through rocks, they would hang tarps, or if it was a sensitive area, they would actually hang plastic tarps to help protect the cave. And you can see in the middle picture there's actually like a tent built. And if they were doing, again, work that kicked up a lot of dust or even welding, like with the handrails, they would actually hang a tarp and they would ventilate it. They would have an exhaust pipe that went from the tarp all the way outside. So they're really, really careful about how they did this. But it looks like a blast, right? I don't know about you guys, but I don't know if I would want to stand on a ladder like that. Unstable cave floor. I know that area, that's pretty far down there, but anyways, good group of people who did a lot for us. And real briefly, I'm running out of time, like I said, I'm going to mention a few things of the geology, just a little bit about how the cave was formed. Kartchner Caverns, you can see it there, sits in a down-dropped block of limestone at the base of the Whetstone Mountains, on top of an alluvial fan. And the Whetstone Mountains are part of the Basin Range province. I'm sure you're all familiar with Basin Range. Massive, massive geological event that occurred between about 5 and 15 million years ago. And it extends all the way from southern Oregon all the way into central Mexico. So it's a big area, crustal extension, right? Formed blocks and faults. Some blocks went up, some blocks went down, creating basins, ranges, or mountains and valleys. I'm sure you're all familiar with that. And Kartchner Caverns, Whetstone Mountains aren't necessarily the most impressive range in that group, but Apache Peak, which is the tallest point, is about 7,700 feet. And there's some other cool, interesting stuff going on geologically here. Most of the mountains are made out of limestone. Limestone is really important, but there's also some Bolsa quartzites, some Pinal schists, some Precambrian granite. That's most of what you're going to be seeing if you come visit the park. If you notice, that's actually a view from the tram loading area. So when you're getting on the tram to go see the cave, that's what you see, minus all the arrows. I'll go back to this slide here. You're going to notice that Kartchner Caverns, that little block of limestone they're sitting in, is pretty isolated. There's not a lot down there outside of those foothills in terms of other limestone features. And now compared to the rest of the basin ranges, the whetstones are relatively simple and unfaulted. But through fault mapping and studying marker beds in the cave, they found that there was thousands of displacement faults inside of that small block. There's more than 60 mapped major faults in that small chunk of rock. And let's skip forward here. If you notice here on the side where Kartchner Caverns is located, and the type of rock there, which is once again entirely located inside of Escabrosa limestone, matches up with the tops of the Whetstone Mountains. So what we believe happened is during that basin and range faulting event, that chunk of limestone actually broke off from the top of the mountains and slowly made its way down to where it sits, which is quite a long ways to go for such a large rock, right? And probably not the smoothest ride ever. So that would explain why there's so many faults, so many cracks in those hills. But those faults are extremely important to our cave. Also, after that basin and range faulting event, streams start to cut canyons in the mountains, pretty standard mountain formation, right? But those streams are going to be transporting eroded boulders, sediments, gravel, sand, clay, all that stuff down to the basin. And this is those areas where the sediment fills is known as an alluvial fan. That's where Kartchner Caverns sits. And most of those basins did not have drainage outlets. So during periods of wetter climate, a lot of them filled with shallow lakes. And we found that about 500,000 years ago or so, there was a shallow lake sitting there. I'm just looking forward to this just so you can look at it. We're running out of time. But that would have raised the water table, right? So you got a highly faulted chunk of limestone, you got a high water table, and limestone caverns are actually dissolution caves, which means they're dissolved away. So you're going to have rainwater as it comes through the atmosphere, as it passes through the atmosphere, it's going to be picking up carbon dioxide. It becomes slightly acidic, known as carbonic acid, right? So you have a high water table sitting in between a lot of faults, and then you're going to have acidic water coming in, mixing with that, sitting inside that rock, and that over time starts to dissolve away the passages, right? And that is actually how Kartchner Caverns was formed. Yeah, so once again, kind of a stars aligning type of situation for our cave there. Yeah, for sake of time, I'm going to move on. Here's one more picture of some marker beds. If you come to Kartchner Caverns, you can see the marker beds. They're very distinctive. You can see the colors there. Mapping those marker beds helped us determine where those chunks of limestone came from. And there's a topographical map. There's some showing the ceilings. The color coding corresponds to the ceilings of the rooms correspond with each marker bed there. But briefly, I just want to mention some above ground conservation that we're doing. NPN stands for the National Phenology Network. Basically, we're part of the Flowers for Bats campaign. We're monitoring the flowering of the agave palmeri population, which is the predominant agave population in the park, for the sake of the lesser long-nosed bats. They depend on these for a food source. So we basically monitor when they flower, how long they're flowering, and basically tracking how that is changing over time as the way our climate is changing. This project, the Noxious Weeds project, is actually currently on hold, but we do have noxious weed removal. SIA stands for Sky Island Alliance. We are in partnership with them to monitor springs around the area. And we also monitor the well levels around there. And I wanted to talk a lot about plants, but unfortunately I already talked too much. So I'm just gonna, I have a few pictures here. These are just, I like talking about plants just as much as the rest of us. I'm a member of the Plant Society myself too, but I just wanted to show you a few pictures that I've taken that just are some of my favorite plants on park. I'm gonna move through this pretty quickly, but ragged nail spurge, this is one of my favorite plants. I love the spurge family. They just fascinate me. That picture did not turn out very well, but this is Cochise beard tongue. It's a pretty rare Pistemon. Those pop up now and then. Clasping Venus's Looking Glass, one of my favorite flowers. Was on the park. Huachuca Mountain Rock Trumpets, beautiful. Oregon Mountain, these are pretty cool. Oregon Mountain Larkspur. I've only seen these bloom one time, and that was last year when we had a really wet winter. I'd never seen them bloom prior to that, but that was exciting. Mariposa lilies, Munn's Mariposa lily on the left. And I believe, I'm not entirely sure, but I believe that's an Arizona Mariposa lily on the right. If I'm wrong, maybe somebody can correct me. One of the most beautiful flowers around Arizona Carlaraites. Again, this is a plant that I've only seen bloom one time on the park. I've only seen one individual as well. Yeah, San Pedro Cape Trefoils, obvious P right there. But yeah, here's my works cited page. And also, if anyone is interested in volunteering, we're always looking for help. Our volunteer coordinator, his name is Kyle Reisterer. You're more than welcome to email him if you have any questions. And it can be anything from helping out with cave tours, working at the gatehouse, campground hosting, or if you have a specific skill set that you can bring to the table, we're into that too. We have a volunteer right now doing herpetological studies on the park for us. So, or if you just want to get in the cave for free, it's up to you. And I included my contact info there as well, in case anyone gets in touch with me. But anyways, that is about all I have. So.
And one question, which may be for you, but may also be for attendees: has anyone done a plant list for the park?
So that is actually one of my projects that I've been working on. And once again, like I said, I don't have formal botanical training. I'm self-taught, so I'm moving pretty slowly with it. There's a few things that I'm needing help and ID with, but I've been using iNaturalist. I've been using various other resources to help me out with that. But at this point, I've ID'd like 230 different plant species on park, and it's kind of a work in progress, right? I don't have a lot of time to go out and look at plants every day, but I'm kind of working on that. But if somebody would want to be involved with that, if somebody would like to come out and start a plant list, I am all for it, and I would love to hear or see what you find. I'd love to possibly even collaborate on that.
Dylan, I might add that the Native Plant Society sponsors a special program in cooperation with several other organizations called Plant Atlas Project Arizona, PAPAZ. And the goal of that is to have individuals who are trained through the program to come out to a specific area and do precisely what you just described, namely contribute towards a flora or a plant list or something. Awesome. So maybe that would be something really good to put in your direction there, when we get some people that are in that program.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. It sounds great.
And Dylan, I did want to mention, you had mentioned Charles Etherly, and I do see a name, Charles Etherly. I assume that it is the Charles Etherly. Sir, would you like to unmute and say a word or two?
Well, I could, yes, I was very impressed with the talk, and I thoroughly enjoyed it because there was a lot of things that I don't know about this part of the cave. I know the early history and all the way through acquisition and development, but after that point, then it was very interesting to know all of these things are going on. So yes, it's so thank you, Donald. I really appreciated and thinking about all the photographs and things. I've got quite a few of those too, so might be able to compare a few notes.
Nice. Yeah, I would love to hear some more.
I see one more question in the chat. It says, Dylan, can you mention the PIT, the pit tagging project?
Yes, I was going to mention that as part of it. We forgot. But yeah, part of the mist netting is if we catch the Myotis bellifer bat, the common cave bat, we do pit tagging, which is basically microchipping. PIT stands for passive integrated transponder, I believe. But basically, we microchip the bats, and there's a group of researchers that have pit tag readers or antennas set up around the entrances of a few caves around the area, and a pretty large area, the southwest down into Mexico even. And every time they pass through those readers, they can download that information and be able to tell what bat goes where, exactly when it was there, when it left, and it kind of helps study the migratory patterns and how the bats are behaving, what caves they're using. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Dylan, for
Welcome.
very comprehensive, interesting presentation, and thank you for all the great work you're doing there. It's sure nice to know that someone of your interest and skills and dedication are helping with that, preserve that wonderful place and make it available for years to come.